Good evening, everyone. I told myself that I would make a new episode once we got to 2,000 subscribers, and, well, congratulations, we finally made it. So here's a new episode for all of y'all. I hope you enjoy it. I was going to spend some time today talking about the culture that existed in America back in the day and how it probably influenced the creation of D&D. Dave and Gary both came from wargaming backgrounds. Why would they make a fantasy role-playing game, though? They both tended to be military history guys. Why didn't they just make a role-playing game based on some historical battle somewhere? And also, back in the day, most of the war games were done with miniatures placed onto a field somewhere, usually on either a normal table or a sand table. But when D&D first began, it was mostly just a verbal experience. The guys I all played with were all just talking. There were almost no miniatures anywhere to be seen. The older books don't really talk much about miniatures at all. Why did it become mostly just verbal? Why did D&D become what it became? By all rights, it should have become something very different. So anyway, I grew up not far from Dave and Gary. That gives me some local knowledge about what was happening back then. They were older than I was, though. Gary was born in the late 30s and Dave was born in the late 40s. I wasn't born until the 60s. Nevertheless, I do know something of what was going on back then. I'll admit, though, that these are all merely my opinions. You'll have to judge for yourself what value my input has. To begin with, though, I thought I should mention one thing that seemed important. Aside from its obvious roots in fantasy and the occasional foray into science fiction, D&D has its roots in two other main genres of fiction: horror, but also action and adventure. D&D spends a lot of time examining monsters, magic, and evil. At the same time, though, it spends an equal amount of time dealing with heroes who go out on quests to vanquish that evil. So keep that in mind. As gamers, we can lay claim to four different foundations of literature: fantasy, science fiction, horror, but also action and adventure. To show all these early influences on D&D, I'm going to have to show clips and art from all sorts of different sources. This means that I'm going to lean pretty heavily on fair use. Without it, I could probably be sued, and I can't have that for a pro bono channel like this. One thing that would influence a judge in my favor is if my channel remains non-profit. Were I to monetize the channel, it would increase the odds of a judge finding in favor of whoever would sue me. So please keep that in mind. I have received notices from YouTube that the time would come that I may be forced to monetize my channel. If this ever happens, be prepared, I will be taking the channel down. I don't make any money from this. The few donations I have received, so far less than $100, is certainly not enough to pay for anything more than a 5-minute conversation with some lawyer somewhere. And in that 5-minute conversation, I'm sure all he would say is, "I'm sorry, you're going to lose everything." So, oh wait. Actually, I already spent the $100 on a lunch, so I guess I don't even have enough left for the 5 minutes. So, be prepared. This channel may not last forever. As I've mentioned before, you have my permission to download the episodes to your own hard drives. You might want to do that if you want to keep watching these things. Anyway, here we go. European and American culture has always had access to the old boogeyman stories from a long time ago. Vampires, ghouls, ghosts, elves, brownies, dragons, and giants. That rich deposit of horror potential has always been a huge part of our culture, and telling scary stories has always been a part of it too. Sometimes they did it to entertain, sometimes they just did it to keep kids scared and obedient. Either way, though, it's always been there. If you've seen the movie Tolkien that came out in 2019, there were scenes of the mother telling fantastic stories to her children before she died. It is absolutely no surprise at all why Tolkien began to write about fantasy. And he wasn't the only one who had a parent stoking their imagination. There were always a lot of fantastic stories out there getting told to children just before they went to bed. The Knights of the Round Table, King Arthur, A Tale of Magic and Knights, right? Shakespeare's Hamlet, a ghost story, Macbeth, witches, the Iliad and the Odyssey, a monster story, Beowulf, another monster story. Scaring people has always been a very strong part of our culture. During the 1800s, a whole flock of new writers showed up making money off of fantasy and horror. I'm going to give special attention to Mary Shelley. Here, let me explain why. Mary Shelley was writing about reanimating corpses in 1818. She was a teenage girl, and in my opinion, she invented the entire science fiction movement. Mary Shelley's book, Frankenstein, it was alternately titled The Modern Prometheus. I looked it up, and Prometheus was the Greek Titan god of fire, and he was credited in the stories anyway as having made man from clay. So he created man, according to the stories. And Dr. Frankenstein also created man. But Dr. Frankenstein wasn't a god. So perhaps you could consider Mary Shelley as the moment in time when the torch that mythology carried was passed on to science fiction. I don't know if she's the first, but she's the first science fiction author I personally am aware of. I would call her the grandmother of science fiction, but if you know anything about her life, instead I think what I'm going to call her is the great juvenile delinquent grandmother of science fiction. That seems to be a better fitting title. Of course, she wasn't the only writer. Don't forget, as gamers, we are laying claim not only to fantasy, but also to horror and to action and adventure genres. It makes it so we can point to a whole bunch of books as our foundations. The Brothers Grimm, Washington Irving, Victor Hugo, Hans Christian Andersen, Edgar Allan Poe, of course, James Fenimore Cooper, Charles Dickens, Lewis Carroll, Jules Verne, Robert Louis Stevenson, Bram Stoker. These are the only ones that I'm listing because these are the only ones I can fit on the page comfortably. Scout around. The 1800s had a lot of fun and exciting stuff to check out. If you pull out your first edition copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide and look on page 224, under the title Inspirational Reading, you'll see a list of books that Gary Gygax himself wanted you to see. These are the books that he felt inspired him to do what he did with Dungeons & Dragons. I'm just going to mention these because I've got a convenient list made by Gary Gygax himself. Dave Arneson also had a bunch of books that he was very deeply moved by, but he never made a list like Gary Gygax did. If you want some good ideas of what would be on his list, here's a homepage, a discussion page that I found, and you can look through that, but none of this is verifiable. So I'm just going to read Gary Gygax's list, and then we'll see what happens after that. Edgar Rice Burroughs, Lord Dunsany, Manly Wade Wellman, H.P. Lovecraft, Jack Williamson, Robert E. Howard, Abraham Merritt, August Derleth, Stanley Weinbaum, J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, L. Sprague de Camp, Frederick Brown, Lee Brackett, Andre Alice Norton, Fletcher Pratt, Fritz Lieber, Paul Anderson, Philip Jose Farmer, Michael Moorcock, Jack Vance, John Bellairs, Lynn Carter, Gardner Fox, Margaret St. Clair, Roger Zelazny, Sterling Lanier, and Fred Saberhagen. There was one name that I also thought should have been mentioned. In the Module X2 Castle Amber, the author, Tom Moldvay, lists a bunch of works by the author Clark Ashton Smith, so I'm going to include him in this section as well. What I found out as I was doing my research to prep for running the X2 module is that it appears that some of Mr. Smith's writings have actually fallen into the public domain. There's a page on the net that you can go to where you can read a lot of his stuff. When I made my guide for X2, I was able to include in the guide copies of all the works that Tom Moldvay listed in the back of X2. Here's the URL for the page. I'll also include a link to it in the description area for this video. As you look across this list, you'll notice something kind of obvious. First, none of these works were written after 1973. It makes sense in that D&D was first published in 1974, and everything published after that was not an influence on the creation of D&D. From this point on, all throughout the rest of this episode, I'm only going to be mentioning stuff that was published up to 1974, so I'm sorry folks, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, it's not going to be mentioned here, except to say that I'm not going to be mentioning it here, because it was released in 1975. Pretty much everyone listening to this probably always can remember a time when they had a TV in their house. The old-timers, though, the baby boomers, remember what it was like before TV. Back then, at night, people sat around a radio listening to the old shows, Burns and Allen, Amos and Annie, etc. There were plenty of scary radio shows as well. Here's a good page of some scary radio shows I found on the net. The last one, The Dark, honestly speaking, it's kind of amazing how scary a story can become in just 7 minutes. One thing about radio, which is what Dave and Gary were both raised on, it's entirely verbal, just like early D&D. There were no pictures, the entire effect of the shows was done just with people speaking and with a few audio special effects. TV didn't really become a common thing until the 1960s. That means that these two probably didn't have TV until Dave was a teenager and Gary was in his 20s. They were very used to just hearing scary stories. All of the great horror movies were made back in the 30s and 40s. I'm going to talk about movies a little bit here, but I'll talk about them more later on. The Creature of the Black Lagoon, that was the last of the great classic monster movies. That was made in 1954. The thing about these movies was that people saw them when they were first released, and then no one ever really saw them again. There was the occasional showing of them in movie theaters, I assume, but very often people went decades without seeing them. This changed, though, once TV showed up. Starting in 1956, TV gave people access to these old movies again. The first shown was The Wizard of Oz, but after that, many old movies were shown on TV all of the time, often late at night. It wasn't long after that the old monsters became a popular thing again. For a while, the old monsters were kind of in fashion. The Munsters and the Addams Family were both released in 1964 and were primetime TV shows. Primetime. People watched them at 7 o'clock in the evening on weekdays. These were the shows that were competing for the highest ratings of all of the other TV shows on the tube at any time slot. Surprisingly, according to Butch Patrick, the kid who portrayed the young werewolf Eddie in The Munsters, the Munsters would eventually be canceled due to the rise in popularity of the new Batman TV show with Adam West. I mean, think about it. Batman and the Munsters were competing for the highest ratings in TV back then? It was a really different world back then. This is the intro of an old TV show that I watched when I was young. It was broadcast in the Midwest on KSTP, an NBC affiliate back then. The show's name was, as you can see, Horror Incorporated. It began in 1969 and it showed a monster movie every Saturday night. For the record, in 1969, Dave Arneson was in college in the Twin Cities, so he probably knew all about this show. The show had a few hosts. One would dress up like a vampire and introduce the movies. I don't know his name, but he actually visited one of the D&D games I was playing with Fred Funk back in 1985. He didn't spend a lot of time there. He just stood in the doorway and looked scary. We told him that we were playing D&D and invited him in. He just looked at us and, in character, politely refused and said that he instead preferred to play real D&D. We had no idea what he was talking about, but it was spooky and kind of fun. For a short while, when I was still very young, the show was canceled. Maybe it had just been moved to a different time slot, I really don't know, but I do remember calling information. The place where you called back in the day to get a lady to look up phone numbers for you. And I asked her why Horror Incorporated had been canceled. It was information, right? And I wanted information, so I called information. Apparently, I really missed the show, and it seems that the lady had some pull with the local TV executives because not long afterwards the show came back on air. I am joking, of course. I think I was about 7 years old when I did this. As a side note, the classic old monsters remained popular for actually quite some time. In 1970, there was the Archie's spin-off cartoon called The Groovy Ghoulies. These were old Saturday morning cartoons. Oh yeah, and let's not forget this guy. In Sesame Street, this character, the Count, made his debut in 1972. It really is hard to overstate how popular the old classical monsters were back then. There was also a vampire-themed soap opera, believe it or not. It ran from 1966 to 1971 and was called Dark Shadows. I don't think I ever saw any of the episodes. I did have the board game, though. For some reason, I really liked it. The last influence I'm going to mention is an old TV show that not many people seem to know about. It came out in 1972, though, and it was called The Night Stalker. It came out first as 2 made-for-TV movies, but then it came out as a full-fledged TV show that only lasted for 1 season. It's a good show, though. It really feels like the 70s when you watch it. Anyway, a lot of people see this show as a precursor to The X-Files. The show is interesting not only because of its theme, monsters, but also in how much of the show's content seemed to find its way into your D&D books. The show spoke about the common stuff, like vampires and werewolves, but they also mentioned stuff like Rakshasas and Quetzalcoatl and Asmodeus. I'm not kidding. They had an episode on Asmodeus, which he pronounced as Asmodeus. Maybe I've just been pronouncing it wrong for the last 40 years, I don't know. Anyway, it seems pretty obvious that someone who is writing the D&D rulebooks got some of their info from this show. By the way, the main hero of the story, Darren McGavin, you may recognize him as the guy from A Christmas Story. By the way, if you noticed the same thing I did, when he did the show, he was 61 and the mother was 44, a 17-year difference between the two. Yeah, I always thought he was a pretty lucky guy too. This isn't going to be a huge section. I just wanted to mention a few things to show how influential horror was back then. In 1962, there was also an old song that was really famous, which I deeply and desperately loved at the time. It was called the Monster Mash. It's a little embarrassing to think about how much I loved it back then. Later on, in 1972, there was the song Frankenstein by the Edgar Winter Group. I'd love to let you listen to some of it, but when it comes to music, people get especially lawsuit happy. They love suing each other, and I don't want to be a part of that. Anyway, check it out. It's a cool song. Also, in 1971, 3 breakfast cereals debuted: Count Chocula, Frankenberry, and Boo Berry. I always preferred Frankenberry myself. The one thing you need to realize about all this stuff I've been mentioning is that all of these old influences on D&D were all also accompanied by assorted merchandise. T-shirts, games, posters, books, magazines, comic spin-offs. There was a lot of monster memorabilia floating around out there back then. At the beginning of this episode, I said that D&D could claim 4 different genres of fiction as its foundations: fantasy, science fiction, horror, and also action and adventure. I'm going to talk about movies now, but if I sat here and just showed 5-second clips of all the movies from each of these 4 genres that had an influence on Dave and Gary, probably, and on the creation of D&D, probably, I could very easily be here for hours, so I'm not going to show everything. I just can't. Instead, I was just going to focus on one movie maker that doesn't seem to get much attention nowadays. People haven't really been talking about his work much since companies like Pixar started doing CG animation. His name was Ray Harryhausen, and he made movies from 1949 until 1980, I think. If you were to check out each and every piece of stop animation that he did throughout his career, you would probably be able to find them all somewhere in one of the monster manuals. A lot of people know his name, but I get the feeling that the D&D crowd isn't really aware of how much his work influenced this hobby. As I've been talking, I've been showing some of his work and what it became in our game. I don't think I'm going to show everything, though. I would love to, but really, you should instead check out this video on YouTube. They show each of his animations, and there's some pretty cool music that goes along with it. I can't overstate how influential I believe Ray Harryhausen was on early D&D. I will mention one more movie, though. There's so many I could mention, but I'm just going to mention one more. Night of the Living Dead. Because of my church, I try to avoid R-rated movies. Strangely, though, my church is where I saw this movie for the very first time. The person who is in charge of youth activities in our ward decided to put on a Halloween party. He couldn't attend himself, but he thought it'd be fun to show the kids a scary movie. He didn't know what movie to show, so he asked a friend from work, and the friend suggested Night of the Living Dead. So there we sat, a bunch of young, morally sheltered Christian youth watching zombies kill and eat a bunch of people. We had a dinner after the party, and some of the girls were taking pieces of meat and trying to eat them in the same way the zombies had been eating people in the movie. They were rocking back and forth, chewing on the meat and moaning in upsetting ways. It was a really interesting church activity. Anyway, the youth leader got up and apologized the next day at church. It was an activity I don't think I'm ever going to forget. And officially speaking, Night of the Living Dead isn't actually an R-rated movie. It is listed as unrated. I personally would rate it as an R-rated movie, though. That movie was also the moment in time when monster movies stopped being cute and campy. Things got and stayed very serious after that. It was a direct predecessor to all the R-rated horror movies of today. I'm not a fan of those. I really like the classic monsters. But you gotta admit that it played a very historic role in filmmaking, and I assume it had a very big influence on D&D. A lot of changes happened in the comic book industry starting in 1954. There was a psychologist who attacked the comics. He stated before Congress that they, in general, were a serious cause of juvenile delinquency and sexual perversion. His name was Frederick Wortham, and what he did eventually led to the creation of the Comics Code Authority. It was just a symbol that a self-imposed censorship committee placed on the covers of comics that they felt were morally clean enough. So, for a while, comics were prevented from being too horrific or too sexual. No one appears to be abiding by the Comics Code Authority anymore, though. As a result of this, not a lot of horror comics were made after 1954. Some did exist, but they weren't, in my opinion, very scary, and none of them ever really achieved the same level of popularity as did the superhero comic books. Many companies circumvented the Comics Code Authority by instead publishing magazines. A lot of horror magazines got published in the 60s. These magazines did not abide by the Comics Code Authority. I only have one of these. This is a copy of Creepy from February of 1966. The artist, Frank Frazetta, my favorite, did a lot of covers for this and for other horror magazines. I was thinking about showing you one of these stories. It'll help you see what the writing was like back then. This is Uncle Creepy. He's kind of the narrator of the magazine. He has something to say at the beginning and at the end of each story. My opinion. It is currently the fashion to see what Frederick Wertham did as a bad thing. I'm a supporter of free speech, so to some degree I do agree with his critics, but I don't give full support to them. Comics, like movies, music, and even D&D, can go too far. I'd like to know if something is bad before I see it so I can avoid it if I want to, and as a parent, I want to know what my kids are seeing. So as a free speech advocate, evil can get published as far as the law allows it to be. That's fine with me. I want them to have the same rights as I do. but a forewarning is helpful so I can know what to avoid. P.S. In this episode, I'm listing everything that I feel influenced Dave and Gary and led D&D to what it eventually became. Unfortunately, I can't vouch for all of it, though. Among these early works are probably going to be some items that do have immoral portions to them. So if you're contemplating checking out some of this stuff, be prepared. You may bump into some unpleasant surprises. The rule of thumb is that older tends to be cleaner, but this isn't even true all the time. Today's episode is about history, and I don't edit history, so I'm including stuff that was influential, even though some of it I personally am not at all interested in checking out. In 1971, a new thing happened in Minnesota, which it appears has become somewhat popular all over the states now: Renaissance festivals. I don't know who did the first one. All I know is that Minnesota got ours in 1971. I was 5 years old, and I went to it. I was there. I actually went to the very first one. We lived not far from the University of Minnesota, and next to us was a house full of hippies. Some of them were very nice. Some of them were kind of weird. Over the course of several days, or maybe even weeks, in their backyard, the hippies made something out of fiberglass. I think it was fiberglass. It was like a party for them. I just remember the entire neighborhood smelling like beer. It slowly turned into this big horse that had wheels on it rather than legs. They actually made two, if I remember right. Later on, I found out what they were doing. At the actual Renaissance Festival, which was, honestly speaking, just a few tents set up in a field, it really was a completely homemade event. I got to see what the horses were there for. At one end of the festival, there was a hill. They would pull these horses to the top of the hill, and you could climb onto these horses and ride them down it. Honestly speaking, it's one of the most dangerous memories I have. I remember someone putting me onto the horse, and then they let go of the horse, and it started rolling down the hill with me on it. There was nothing to hold on to, and the entire back of the horse was made of fiberglass, so it was really slippery. I didn't make it far down the hill before I slid off of it. Luckily, someone caught me, and I didn't crash onto the ground and die. I am amazed that no one died that day. It was a very dangerous activity, but that's from the perspective of a 5-year-old, so keep that in mind. Anyway, it was really interesting, and is probably something that I'll never forget. By the way, for some reason, I also remember eating corn on the cob and picking wild grapes with my dad there. That's all I remember of the day. Like I said, though, I was only 5. It wouldn't surprise me if Dave Arneson had actually been involved in that festival. I have seen pictures of him when he was young, dressed in Renaissance clothing with a friend, and in 1971, he was graduating from the University of Minnesota. He was in Minnesota at the time. It wouldn't surprise me at all if Dave Arneson himself hadn't been in my neighbor's backyard making horses out of fiberglass and stinking up the neighborhood with beer. It wouldn't surprise me at all. So I'm going to show you a chart now, and it looks really convincing and academic, yada yada yada, but it isn't. All the chart does is show all the influences that I've mentioned in this episode today and line them up by the year they each occurred. And even then, this isn't adequately accurate. Each of these books were sold from the year they were first published and on, right? So by all rights, they should each appear in each year after their first year of publication as well. Also, as far as the magazines and comics go, they should each be included each year. Subsequent issues of them were sold. And yes, superhero comics do belong in this list. They are both a form of science fiction and action and adventure, so they belong here. There's also a whole bunch of other stuff that should be on the list but isn't, just because I can only show so much stuff in a half hour. So yes, it is an imperfect list, but hopefully it illustrates something significant. Before I did this episode, I simply thought that The Lord of the Rings was the main influence that brought about D&D, and then I stopped right there. I didn't think any deeper than that. Even when Major David Wesley told me otherwise, I didn't change my opinion, and even according to other sources, Gary Gygax didn't even like The Lord of the Rings that much. He thought it was boring. So in the face of all those other opinions, I still kept to my guns, right? Now that I've completed this episode, my opinion has changed. I'm better informed now. What I'm personally taking away from this list is that the hinge point of all of this seems to be the point when TV started showing old movies. It appears that the culture shift towards monsters and fantasy was led primarily by TV. This in turn probably had a big influence on the creation of D&D. It's pretty obvious, though, that a very fantasy and monster-friendly environment existed back then. Anyway, I guess I'll just let you be the judge. There's a lot of cool stuff that this hobby has at its foundation. I suggest that you check some of it out. All the new horror and fantasy stuff has its value, but But if you check out the old stuff, you might be amazed at how stories with low or sometimes even no special effects at all can still move you emotionally. Before I go, I'm going to take a minute and show you an old book I've had here for quite some time now. It's called Asmodeus, or The Devil on Two Sticks. I picked this up from eBay a long time ago. I was thinking about turning it into a campaign. As I looked through it though, it appears to be a little on the racy side, so I don't need it. According to this eBay page, it appears to have been published in 1925. It's not in the best shape, but if you're interested, I was thinking we could have a silent auction. The minimum bid would be $30. That should be enough to pay for the shipping. Whoever bids the most by February 1st would get it, as soon as you pay for it, of course. Well, I guess that's it. As I leave though, I'll be playing the outro from that TV show I watched when I was a kid, Horror Incorporated. Check out the ending scream especially. I'm not sure, but I believe they got that scream from that old radio show I showed you earlier. It was called The Dark. Thanks. I appreciate it. It was nice to get a chance to do another episode. And as always, have a nice day.
Horror Incorporated.